Well, I think it's a good idea, and I think that, Nell has done some work on this. I think the underlying logic of that is that just as it makes sense for states with higher cost of income and higher average weekly wages to have higher minimum wages than the national, I think it also makes sense for places that have done this, like San Francisco and Santa Fe, to have higher minimum wages than their states. And the same is true of New York City. I don't think any place could be a better example of this than New York City. So I think the federal minimum wage needs to be increased. The state minimum wage in places like New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut needs to be higher than the federal minimum wage, and I think it would make sense for New York City to have even a higher minimum wage.
Okay. And what about the indexing? You said that it could be a difficulty. Do you?
Well, I think indexing is essential. I know that legislators have tried in the past to get the minimum wage in New York tied to inflation, and there have been proposals in the past to tie it to average weekly wages as well. And so I know it hasn't happened and it should happen, but I think underlying my recommendation is I don't think we should start indexing until we get the wage to a level that restores the purchasing power. If we start indexing at because indexing is so important, if we start indexing at a wage level that is not adequate, I think it's going to make it harder to have legislated jumps later on if you have in place a law which has it going up automatically each year. So, and I'm not saying the ideal should be the enemy of the good, and I know that whatever you can accomplish this year in increasing the minimum wage is important, but I think indexing the minimum wage at a level which is too low has downsides.
So you mentioned also that the fact that it would help create 7,500 jobs, you said?
Well, what we've done is, and attached to my testimony are two reports we issued. One that we issued in January, which has a comprehensive history of the minimum wage in New York and a lot of economic analysis. And there we looked at a three-step increase going to $10 an hour in 3 years. And because of the increased purchasing power and the way that trickles through the economy, using an input-output economic model, we estimate that on balance, that would have a 25,000 job increase.
So you think that this is a good economic development strategy, as opposed to, let's say, the regional councils?
Well, at the very least, I think what's been shown by our research and other researchers' work is that the minimum wage increases in reasonable steps does not have a negative economic effect, and we're saying it has a modest positive effect. So increasing jobs by 25,000, or for the 850 bill by 7,500, is a world of difference from reducing employment. But whether or not I would say this is a bonanza for economic development, I don't know I would go that far. I would say, on balance, we are convinced that the impact is positive. It's modestly positive, but positive. And given that there are so many other economic, social, and moral reasons for increasing the minimum wage, we don't think the argument that it hurts business could be justifiable. Our report that we issued in January of 2007 looked specifically at the minimum wage increase enacted in 2004 in New York State, and we found that the industries that critics claim would be affected by this, primarily retail and restaurants, grew just as fast in New York as they grew nationally.
And what's your recommendations for the food service workers in terms of the increase?
Well, I think there are two problems. One, the minimum wage for tipped workers isn't always made up by tips, and it needs to be included. And so I think the fact that your bill and other proposals would increase the minimum wage for tipped workers is important also. I would defer to others on whether or not there's an economic argument for eliminating the separate wage for tipped workers.
Thank you.
One question, Mr. Morrow. So the clergy that previously testified answered this question. Wanted to get your background in it. So the opponents call this a job killer. Can you just elaborate into a little bit more detail how you would project, why you project that an increase in the minimum wage will actually create jobs?
I think the difference is there's two main branches of economics. Macroeconomics, which is based on the overall size of the economy, the overall levels of employment, wages, investment, and microeconomics, which is analysis at the firm level. I don't think it's outrageous to say that at the firm level, if you have a very large increase in the minimum wage, that it might in some cases require an employer to downsize or to not increase employment. But I think that while that's true in a small number of cases, it's not true overall. In fact, what happens is by not having indexing of the minimum wage, we go through these long periods of time where the purchasing power of the minimum wage is eroded, where low-wage workers don't share in the benefits of the overall economic growth, and then we realize that it's not legitimate to continue that, and we're faced with having to make large, substantial increases. So I don't think it's irrational to think that if there was a very large one-time increase in the minimum wage, that could have a negative effect on some firms. Well, the difference is that when you increase the minimum wage for the overwhelming majority of workers who continue working, that puts more money into the economy. So I think what the opponents of minimum wage increases ignore is the macroeconomic impact, the effect on the overall size of economic activity. In effect, it's putting more money in the hands of people who need resources to live, and the marginal propensity to consume that money is going to be very high, so it fuels economic activity, and that's more of a macroeconomic concept than a microeconomic concept. And I think given the history of what's happened with minimum wage increases, even if there are some individual firms that might have delayed hiring, that hasn't been true for the economy as a whole. The economy as a whole has continued to grow when there were minimum wage increases.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you.
It is projected that 1 million New Yorkers would benefit from this. Do you have an idea on the breakdown on how many of those are, or what percentage of those are folks that work in small businesses versus, the Walmart types?